In 4 years, a single disease killed between 30 and 60% of every human being alive in Europe. We have had 700 years to figure out where it came from. We still disagree. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347. It left in 1353. In that window, conservative estimates place the death toll at 25 million people across the continent. Higher estimates reach 50 million. For comparison, the entire population of Europe at the time was between 75 and 80 million people. It was not a catastrophe that set civilization back. It was a catastrophe that ended one version of civilization and forced a different one to emerge from the wreckage. And for 7 centuries, the question of where it started, the geographic origin of the pathogen, the moment zero of the pandemic, seemed to have a clear, accepted answer. It came from Central Asia. It traveled the Silk Road. It entered Europe through the Crimean port of Kaffa, carried by Mongol siege forces who catapulted their own plague dead over the city walls. From there, Genoese merchant ships carried the disease into Sicily, and from Sicily it moved north and west until it had touched nearly every corner of the continent. That was the consensus. Then, in October 2022, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Nature that moved the origin point roughly 3,000 miles east, to a specific valley in what is now Kyrgyzstan, and did it with evidence that had been sitting in a graveyard for 700 years, waiting to be read correctly. By the end of this video, you will understand why that discovery didn't close the debate. It reopened it. The Silk Road origin theory was not guesswork. It was built on convergent evidence from multiple directions, and for decades it held. The earliest documented European accounts of the plague describe it arriving from the east. The 14th century chronicler Gabriel de Mussis wrote a first-hand account of the siege of Kaffa in 1345-46, in which Mongol forces besieging the city began dying of plague and, in desperation, catapulted infected corpses over the walls. The Genoese traders inside the city fled by ship. They brought the disease with them. Historian Ole Benedicto of the University of Oslo, in his comprehensive 2004 study The Black Death, The Complete History, reconstructed the spread of the plague across Europe using a database of dated outbreaks and calculated that the disease moved at approximately 2 kilometers per day, consistent with the movement of trade routes, not random animal transmission. The pathogen itself, Yersinia pestis, was identified in 1894 by the Swiss-French bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin of the Institute Pasteur during an outbreak in Hong Kong. Genetic analysis in subsequent decades confirmed that Y. pestis originated somewhere in Central Asia, a region where closely related strains still circulate in wild rodent populations today. So the theory was, Central Asian origin, Silk Road transmission, Kaffa entry point, maritime spread across the Mediterranean. It was clean. It was documented. It was taught in every medieval history course in the world. And then the graves in Kyrgyzstan started speaking. Before the origin question can be fully understood, it helps to understand what Yersinia pestis actually does, because the mechanism of transmission explains why no border, no wall, and no human decision could stop it once it had a foothold. Y. pestis is a bacterium. It lives primarily in rodent populations, rats, marmots, voles, and is transmitted between them by fleas. When infected rodents die in large numbers, their fleas abandon the carcasses and seek new hosts. Humans become accidental hosts. A single flea bite is enough. Once inside a human host, the bacterium targets the lymphatic system. The lymph nodes, in the groin, armpit, and neck, swell into painful, blackened masses called buboes, which gave the bubonic form of the plague its name. Internal hemorrhaging produces the dark blotches on the skin that the medieval populations called the signs. Death follows in 2 to 7 days without treatment. But Y. pestis has 2 other forms that are far more lethal. When the infection reaches the lungs, it becomes pneumonic plague, transmissible through respiratory droplets, person to person, with no flea required and a mortality rate approaching 100% without modern antibiotics. And when it enters the bloodstream directly, septicemic plague kills so fast that medieval accounts describe people going to sleep healthy and never waking up. Physician and medieval historian John Kelly, author of the 2005 study The Great Mortality, documented accounts from the Italian chronicler Marchione di Coppo Stefani, who described people dying within hours of first symptoms, which is consistent with septicemic presentation. A disease with 3 transmission modes, a rodent reservoir that exists across the entire Eurasian continent, and a 14th century world with no understanding of germ theory, no antibiotics, and dense urban populations living in direct contact with the rats that carried it. The question was never whether it would spread. The question was always, from where did it start? In the Chua Valley of northern Kyrgyzstan, in what was then part of the Chagatai Khanate, 2 cemeteries were excavated in the late 19th century by Russian archaeologists, Kyrgyzstan and Burana. The graves dated to 1338 and 1339, 8 years before the plague reached Europe. What made them unusual was not their age. It was what the burial inscriptions said. Many of the headstones, written in Syriac, the language of local Nestorian Christian communities, recorded not just the names of the dead but the cause of death, a word transliterated as mortana, meaning pestilence or plague. In the 2-year span of 1338 to 39, the number of burials in these cemeteries increased by a factor of 10 compared to surrounding years. This had been noted by historians. Philip Slavin of the University of Stirling re-examined the burial records in detail. But the critical step came when a team led by Johannes Krause of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and Philip Slavin extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of 7 individuals buried in those cemeteries. The results, published in Nature in October 2022, confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis DNA in the graves. Not a related strain. Not an ancestor. The Black Death strain itself, with a genetic profile that places it directly on the ancestral branch of the lineage that caused the 14th century pandemic. The study, authored by Maria Spyrou, Philip Slavin, Johannes Krause, and colleagues, identified the Chua Valley strain as the most likely direct ancestor of all the strains that subsequently spread across Eurasia. They called it the Big Bang diversification point, the moment when a single Y. pestis population began branching into the multiple lineages that would circle the globe. The origin point, for the first time, had a name, a location, a date, and a set of human remains that could be analyzed rather than inferred. But this is where the story stops being simple. The 2022 Nature study was celebrated as a resolution. It was not. It was a narrowing, and a very significant one, but 3 major unresolved questions remain in the scientific literature, and each carries a different implication for how we understand the pandemic. The first question, was Kyrgyzstan the origin, or was it simply the earliest documented outbreak? The presence of Y. pestis in the Chua Valley graves confirms that the pathogen was active there in 1338 to 39. It does not confirm that it first emerged there. Y. pestis had been present in Central Asian rodent populations for centuries. The 2022 study authors themselves acknowledge this in the discussion section, noting that the strain could have originated further east, in China, in the Tibetan Plateau, and reached Kyrgyzstan by an earlier, undocumented route. The second question involves China. Medieval Chinese chronicles record epidemic mortality events in the 1330s in Hebei province that some historians, including William McNeill, in his landmark 1976 work Plagues and Peoples, interpreted as early Black Death outbreaks. The genetic evidence does not currently support a Chinese origin for the 14th century strain, but the documentary evidence has not been fully reconciled with the DNA findings, and Chinese archival sources from the period remain incompletely integrated into the Western academic literature on the subject. The third question is the most structurally important. How did the pathogen get from Kyrgyzstan to Kaffa, and then to Sicily, in 8 years? The Silk Road route remains the most plausible mechanism, but the 2022 study did not recover strains from any intermediate sites along that route. The chain of transmission between 1339 and 1347 is still inferred, not documented. 4 research groups, 3 unresolved branches, and a disease that reshaped European civilization sitting at the center of all of them. Here is what the 700 years of investigation have actually revealed, and it is not what most history courses teach. We do not have a confirmed origin for the Black Death. We have a best candidate, supported by the strongest genetic evidence yet assembled, located in a specific valley in Kyrgyzstan, with a date range of 1338 to 39. But the pathogen's deeper history, where it evolved, which rodent species served as its primary reservoir before the pandemic, and which human or commercial contact triggered its catastrophic jump into the Eurasian trade network, remains open. What we do know changes the historical meaning of the event. The Black Death was not a freak accident of proximity, a medieval city too close to the wrong animal at the wrong time. It was the endpoint of a process that unfolded over decades, possibly centuries, in a rodent reservoir spanning thousands of miles, carried invisibly along the most densely trafficked trade network the pre-modern world had ever built. Historian Monica Green of Arizona State University, in her edited volume Pandemic Disease in the Medieval World, published by the journal The Medieval Globe in 2014, argued that the Black Death should be understood as a global pandemic that began in Asia and reached Europe as its western terminus, not as a European event with Asian origins. That reframing matters because it shifts the analytical question from how did it get to Europe to why did it emerge from Central Asia when it did. The answer to that question is still being built, one ancient tooth at a time. So where does this leave us? The Black Death killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in 4 years. It triggered the collapse of feudal labor systems, accelerated the end of the medieval period, contributed to the conditions that made the Renaissance possible, and left a demographic scar on the European continent that took 2 centuries to recover from. Its consequences are not historical artifacts. The social and institutional structures that emerged from the aftermath of the 14th century pandemic, labor rights, public health infrastructure, the relationship between institutions and individual mortality, are the foundations that modern societies are still built on. And we still do not know, with full scientific certainty, where it started. The 2022 Nature study by Krauser, Slavin, Spirou, and their team is the most precise answer the evidence has yet produced. It may be the definitive one. Or the next excavation, in a different valley, in a different country, with a different set of ancient teeth, may move the map again. The Black Death is not a closed case. It is an active investigation. And the reason that matters is not academic. Why pestis still circulates in wild rodent populations on every inhabited continent. The conditions that allowed a single infected flea to trigger a pandemic that ended medieval civilization, dense trade networks, rapid human movement, a pathogen reservoir hidden in animals, are not 14th century conditions. They are today's conditions. If that sits with you differently than it did 20 minutes ago, you're sitting with the same discomfort that drove a team of geneticists to extract DNA from 700-year-old teeth in a Kyrgyzstan graveyard. The investigation is still open. And the next chapter of it will be written by researchers who weren't born yet when the last major theory was published.